against the RAF and waited for the final go-ahead from Adolf Hitler. British Channel convoys offered easy targets. RAF Fighter Command was to be presented with a terrible dilemma: commit fighters to protect the convoys or lose the ships. When plans had been drawn up for Britain's air defence, the RAF had never been asked to include fighter cover for convoys. The cargoes could have been transported by rail, but the Admiralty was insisting that the merchantmen continue to sail for reasons of national prestige. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding was forced to agree to defend the ships, but he was determined to do so with the smallest possible number of fighters. Because of poor weather over the Channel, the German campaign got off to a slow start. It was July the 4th before the Luftwaffe launched its first large-scale convoy attack. The same day, the first fighter sweep in strength was flown over Kent. On the 7th and 8th, the tempo sharply increased. Channel ports were bombed, and more convoys were hit, leaving several ships sunk or damaged. It was Dowding's strategy to refuse to respond to German fighter sweeps, and where possible, these were ignored. But attacks on ships and ports had to be countered, often by units of only 6 or 7 aircraft. It was on July the 10th that the Luftwaffe launched the first massive attacks, clearly intended to draw RAF fighters into combat. July the 10th is the day officially recognized as the start of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe's target was a convoy codenamed Bread, heading from the Thames estuary to the Dover Straits. The raiders were 27 Dorniers of the 2nd Bomber Wing, escorted by 24 110s and the same number of 109s. To meet them, elements of 4 British squadrons were scrambled. 56 and 111 squadrons fielded 18 Hurricanes, 32 Squadron from Biggin Hill scrambled another 6, and 74 Squadron from Hornchurch joined in with 6 Spitfires. In all, 30 British fighters met 75 German aircraft. In a vicious dogfight, 9 German raiders were destroyed and 4 damaged. The RAF lost 1 fighter shot down, 2 crash-landed, and 2 damaged. Only 1 ship was sunk. Although such a rate of exchange was perfectly acceptable to Fighter Command, the results of future clashes would not always be so favorable. On the 19th, when a major battle was fought in the defense of 9 convoys, 11 British aircraft were lost for only 4 Germans shot down. During the following weeks, as increasing numbers of ships were sunk by German bombs, Hugh Dowding faced insistent demands from the Admiralty and from Downing Street that he do more to defend the convoys. As a compromise, he agreed to mount a limited number of standing patrols, a severe drain on his resources. With the real battle yet to begin, the number of sorties flown by Fighter Command was already reaching as many as 600 a day. During the Channel fighting, many British pilots gained their first experience of air-to-air combat. Already, some valuable lessons had been learned. Unofficially, many flyers had begun harmonizing their guns so their fire converged at 250 yards instead of the prescribed 650, to get more concentrated hitting power at close range. The new De Wilde incendiary bullet was proving a valuable aid to marksmanship, and a popular mix of ammunition amongst experienced pilots was to load 2 guns with standard bullets, 2 with armor-piercing rounds, and 2 with incendiaries. Veteran flyers concluded that closely harmonized guns and incendiary bullets made the difference between damaging a German aircraft and shooting it out of the sky. The performance of British fighters was also being improved. New constant pitch propeller units were fitted to increasing numbers of Spitfires and Hurricanes. As a result, British and German fighters were more closely matched than ever before. In spite of this, a disturbing trend was emerging in the Channel combats. British pilots were all too often coming off badly in fighter-to-fighter encounters. The problem, although few realized it, lay with desperately inadequate RAF tactics. The standard RAF unit was a Vic of 3 aircraft, flying in close formation. In a turn, the 2 inside aircraft had to throttle back to allow the one outside to accelerate round. Maneuvers had to be gentle if flyers were to hold their place, and much of the agility of the single-seat fighter was lost. Equally dangerous, a 3-aircraft formation would eventually break in the turmoil of combat, and there was a very high chance that one pilot would be left flying alone. For a fighter pilot, the most dangerous situation imaginable. The British fighter squadron was made up of 12 aircraft, split into 2 flights, each of 2 Vics. Because the fighters were packed tightly together, the formation was easy to spot in the sky, and the high risk of collision meant that little of any pilot's attention could be devoted to watching for the enemy. Sometimes an extra aircraft was placed to weave behind and keep a lookout. Alone and highly vulnerable, the chances of survival for a tail-end Charlie were slim, and the practice was soon abandoned. The tactics of the Luftwaffe were immeasurably better suited to the realities of air fighting. The basic formation was the Rotor of 2 aircraft, a leader and his wingman, whose duty it was to support the leader at all times. 2 Rotor made up a section, or Schwarm, normally well spaced and staggered in height and position. The Schwarm was difficult to spot in the sky. It gave plenty of room to each aircraft, and so the time to keep a sharp lookout, and it was easy to maneuver. German fighter pilots had reinvented the First World War crossover turn, in which every aircraft flies at the same speed, but positions within the Schwarm are reversed. No throttle adjustments were needed, and the turn could be tight and fast. 3 Schwarmen, formed up loosely abreast and well spaced, made up a Staffel, or squadron of 12 aircraft. In the first 6 weeks of Channel fighting, the Luftwaffe dropped nearly 2,000 tons of bombs and sank almost 40,000 tons of British shipping. The cost to the German Air Force was 316 aircraft. In those same 6 weeks, the RAF lost just over 200 Spitfires and Hurricanes. As yet, the loss of aircraft posed no real danger to Fighter Command. Deliveries from the factories were at the highest level ever. The real danger lay with the toll of veteran pilots. A high proportion of casualties had been squadron or flight leaders, the most experienced flyers in Fighter Command. With a full-scale German offensive about to be unleashed, less than half of the RAF's remaining fighter pilots had any combat experience whatsoever. By the first week in August, the Luftwaffe had virtually completed its build-up for the Eagle Offensive, the all-out attack on the RAF that was intended to win air supremacy over southern England in a matter of days. The aircraft and the men were in place. Bombs, ammunition and fuel were stockpiled, and the forces were fully organized for the battle ahead. The Luftwaffe in the west was divided into 3 Luftflotten, or air fleets, each a self-contained force of bomber, fighter, reconnaissance, and support units. Of the 3 Luftflotten facing Britain, the strongest was the 2nd Air Fleet, with its headquarters in Brussels. Its area of operations was to the east of a boundary drawn down the centre of England. 2nd Air Fleet was commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a former army officer. Kesselring had under his command 5 wings of Messerschmitt 109 fighters, each of around 100 aircraft, 2 wings of twin-engined 110s, and a mixed group of 109 and 110 fighter bombers, numbering about 40. Kesselring's striking power was 2 wings of Stukas and 6 wings of twin-engined bombers. 3rd Air Fleet was based in France, south of the Seine, and had its headquarters in Paris. The fleet was commanded by Field Marshal Hugo Sperl, the most experienced senior officer in the German Air Force. For escort duties, Sperl had 3 wings of 109 fighters and a wing of 110s. His bomber force was made up of 4 wings of Stukas, some under strength, and 5 wings of twin-engined machines. There was also a single group, around 30 aircraft, of precision night attack and Pathfinder bombers. To the north, in Norway and Denmark, was the 5th Air Fleet, with its headquarters at Stavanger. 5th Air Fleet was commanded by Colonel General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, an ex-army officer. Stumpf had 2 wings of twin-engined bombers and 1 of twin-engined fighters. He also had a wing of 109s, but their range was too limited for operations over Britain. Altogether, 5th Air Fleet had only 163 combat aircraft capable of fighting in the battle. The strength of each fighter command's groups was geared closely to the degree of threat each area faced. 11 Group, closest to France, was by far the strongest of the RAF's fighter groups. 11 Group was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a fighter ace of the First World War and a brilliant tactician. Park had 15 squadrons of Hurricanes and 6 of Spitfires. 10 Group, to the west, had only recently been formed. The group's commander was Air Vice Marshal Sir Christopher Quentin Brand. Brand had 3 Hurricane squadrons and 4 squadrons of Spitfires. 12 Group was based in the Midlands and was the second most important of the RAF's fighter groups. The group was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. Lee Mallory had 6 squadrons of Hurricanes and 5 of Spitfires. To the north, facing Scandinavia and the German 5th Air Fleet, was 13 Group. 13 Group's commander was Air Vice Marshal Richard Saul. Saul had 9 Hurricane squadrons and 4 squadrons of Spitfires. At the start of the July battles, German intelligence had compiled a reasonably accurate picture of RAF fighter strength. But since then, it had overestimated British losses and seriously underestimated the rate of production of new aircraft. Even after so many weeks of operations, the Germans knew very little about Fighter Command's air defense system. Although Germany had developed radar equipment of its own, it had never devised anything like the complex network the British had built. The function of sector station operations rooms was unknown, and it was assumed that the radar control of RAF fighters was rigid and inflexible. On the British side, intelligence was much more effective. By listening to radio traffic, including signals sent when aircraft sets were checked before a sortie, the strength of an imminent raid could be estimated with remarkable accuracy. Britain's most dramatic intelligence breakthrough had happened just before the war. Poland had given the British an example of the secret German code machine, Enigma. The code had been broken, and German radio traffic would be deciphered throughout the Battle of Britain. In the first week of August, decoded German messages included references to an impending Adlerangriff, or Eagle attack. It was clear to the British that the battle was about to enter a new phase. In Führer Directive No. 17, Adolf Hitler authorized Goering to begin the Eagle offensive at any time from August the 5th. Due to logistical problems and the weather, the offensive was postponed twice, but the forecasters finally concluded that August the 13th would see clear conditions for Eagle Day, the start of operations. The day before the aerial armada was to strike, the way would be cleared by the destruction of key British radar stations. The radar installations chosen as targets were the chain home stations at Rye, Pevensey, Ventnor, and Dunkirk, and the chain home low station at Dover. August the 12th began with 11 fighter sweeps by Messerschmitt 109s, starting at 0700 hours, almost 200 fighters altogether. Their role was to draw the defenders away from the target area. At 0840 hours, 16 Messerschmitt 110s took off from Calais. The Raiders belonged to the elite Erprobungsgruppe 210, aircraft evaluation specialists and experts in precision fighter bomber attacks. The first 4 aircraft section of 110s left the main formation and attacked the Dover station. Several buildings were damaged, but the bombs failed to destroy the masts or prevent operations. The second section peeled off inland towards the Chain Home installation at Dunkirk. Buildings were hit and the station stopped transmitting, but the masts survived. Rye was the next target. There, several huts were destroyed, communications were damaged, and the station stopped functioning. Again, the masts remained standing. The last section hit Pevensey. Little damage was done, but by chance a bomb hit the main electricity supply line, and transmission was interrupted. Later in the day, a formation of 80 Junkers 88s, escorted by 120 110s and 25 109s, headed for Portsmouth. 15 of the bombers broke away and attacked the Ventnor station. Almost every building was destroyed, and the masts were damaged. For the rest of the day, the Luftwaffe worked hard to take advantage of the chaos in British defences. Manston Airfield was badly damaged, as were the fighter stations at Hawkins and Lymm. In the Channel, Stukas attacked convoys, sinking 2 small ships, and their 109 escorts shot down 4 Hurricanes. To the Luftwaffe, the day's operations seemed to have been a resounding success. However, in spite of the dash with which the attacks had been carried out, and the loss of 27 German aircraft, little had been achieved. The only targets that really counted were the radar stations, and of the 5 hit, 4 were out of action for no more than 6 hours. Only Ventnor was so badly damaged that it would stay down for several weeks. On Eagle Day, the German formations would find it as difficult as ever to take RAF Fighter Command by surprise. August the 13th, the first day of the Eagle Offensive, got off to a chaotic start for the Luftwaffe. In the morning, the weather was bad with low cloud and poor visibility. Orders went out to postpone operations, but several units never received them, and raids were launched piecemeal, 2 of them without fighter cover. It was mid-afternoon before the weather cleared and the Eagle Offensive could be launched in full strength. The fiercest action would take place in the Portland-Southampton area. The first massive assault was spearheaded by 30 109s and 30 110s. Behind them came 120 Junkers 88 bombers. Their first target was Southampton, which suffered heavy damage. Some of the Junkers broke off and attacked Portland. The raiders were intercepted by elements of 4 British fighter squadrons. The next wave of German raiders was of 77 Stukas, escorted by 109s of the 27th Fighter Wing. Their target was the sector station at Middle Wallop, but en route they were bounced by the returning Spitfires of 609 Squadron, and 9 Stukas were destroyed. Further to the east, there were more Stuka attacks, covered by 109s of the 26th Fighter Wing. The first target was Rochester in Kent, where there was a bomber factory, but the raiders were intercepted by Hurricanes of 56 Squadron and forced to turn back. The second attack was on a Coastal Command airfield at Detling. There, the operations block and all the hangars were destroyed, and 67 people killed. On the first day of the Eagle Offensive, the Luftwaffe flew 1,485 sorties, and the RAF 727. 15 German fighters and 19 bombers were shot down, with another 15 aircraft forced to crash land in France. The RAF lost 12 Hurricanes and 1 Spitfire, with another 4 fighters crash landed. Remarkably, only 3 RAF pilots were killed and 2 seriously wounded. Few, considering the violence of the day's encounters. On the ground, 47 British aircraft had been destroyed, but only 1 was a fighter. The day after Eagle Day, August the 14th, German operations were once more curtailed by the weather. But on the afternoon of the 15th, conditions improved. German intelligence calculated that Fighter Command had just 300 operational aircraft left. And to stretch the defenses to their absolute limit, the Luftwaffe meant to attack with all 3 of its air fleets simultaneously, flying almost 1,800 sorties. In the south, the action began with a raid by 60 Stukas, covered by 40 109 escorts. Their targets were Fighter Command forward airfields at Hawking and Lymm. Both airfields were badly damaged, and Lymm would be out of action for 3 days. The next wave was of 25 110s, which swept in to strafe the airfield at Manston. While the air battles raged in the southeast, the north saw its first major raids. Assured by Luftwaffe intelligence that northern Britain had been stripped of its fighters to reinforce the south, the 5th Air Fleet had targeted airfields and factories in Yorkshire and the Newcastle area. As a prelude to the main assault, a decoy force of 17 seaplanes was sent to trigger the British defences and draw RAF fighters well to the north of the real targets. Hurricanes of 605 Squadron from Drem were dispatched to intercept. Unfortunately for the German bombers, 63 Heinkel 111s, escorted by 21 Messerschmitt 110s, a navigational error led them along the path of the decoys. They ran straight into 605 Squadron's Hurricanes, and elements of 3 more British squadrons joined the chase. The raiders were cut to pieces. To the south, a second attack by 50 unescorted Junkers 88s from Denmark was also badly mauled by fighters from 41 Squadron at Catterick. In the day's battles over the North Sea and northern England, 5th Air Fleet lost 14 bombers shot down, 3 badly damaged, and 7 twin-engine fighters destroyed. The losses were 20% of the fleet's offensive strength, a catastrophic blow. No more daylight raids would be mounted from Scandinavia. Even before the battle in the north was over, the 2nd and 3rd Air Fleets were launching their own gigantic assaults. British radar screens on the Channel coast were so swamped with signals from incoming formations that individual units could no longer be told apart. First in at 1500 hours were 25 fighter bombers of Airpro 210 with an escort of 109s. 3 Hurricanes of 17 Squadron and 9 of No. 1 Squadron tangled with the 109s. But the fighter airfield at Martlesham Heath was hit and badly damaged. Next came 88 Dornier 17s, with a huge fighter escort of 130 109s, backed up by another 60 109s of the crack 26th Fighter Wing, which flew a sweep over Kent. Elements of 5 British squadrons, 39 fighters in all, were scrambled to intercept, but could make almost no impact on such a powerful force. The bombers split into 2 groups, hitting Rochester and airfields at Eastchurch and Hawking. Later in the day, the fighter bombers of Airpro 210 went into action once more. Their intention was to bomb and strafe Kenley, a vitally important sector station. However, the raiders instead hit nearby Croydon. The next raid by 24 Dornier 17s was supposed to be on Biggin Hill, but once more, a navigational error saved a sector station. The raiders hit West Malling, an ordinary fighter airfield, which was not yet fully operational. To the west, another raid, this time of 60 Junkers 88s, escorted by 40 110s, was intercepted in turn by elements of 3 British squadrons, but broke through to hit the sector station at Middle Wallop and airfields at Odiham and Worthy Down, causing some damage. Next came a Stuka attack on Portland. 30 dive bombers, escorted by 109s and 110s. The raiders were intercepted by 18 British fighters from 3 squadrons. August the 15th would prove to be the most hard-fought day of the Battle of Britain. 14 British squadrons saw action. Some of them scrambled several times, and in all, the RAF flew almost 1,000 fighter sorties. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's policy of going for enemy bombers while trying to avoid fighter-to-fighter engagements paid off handsomely. 71 German aircraft were shot down for the loss of 31 British fighters. On 2 of the following 3 days, the Germans maintained the awesome power of their offensive. The radar stations at Ventnor and Poling were badly damaged. Airfield after airfield was attacked, including sector stations at Kenley, Tangmere, and Biggin Hill. Another 100 German aircraft were destroyed for 53 British. In the weeks since Eagle Day, the German air fleets in the west had written off 284 aircraft, 10% of their strength. The slow and unwieldy Stukas had suffered particularly horrific losses, 30 destroyed or badly damaged in one day alone. Even more serious for the Luftwaffe, the vaunted Messerschmitt 110 destroyer, the only long-range German fighter, had shown itself incapable of taking on the Spitfire or the Hurricane. 79 110s had been destroyed in a week. It was a particularly hard blow to the air fleets. Now, the bombers would have to depend exclusively on the 109 for protection, and with no suitable drop tanks available, the endurance of the 109 over Britain was hardly more than 20 minutes. On August the 19th, Hermann Goering announced radical changes to his battle plan. First, the Stukas were to be withdrawn. The 3rd Air Fleet was to concentrate on night bombing, and its 109s were to be transferred to the 2nd Air Fleet, closer to the main area of operations. Attacks were to concentrate on enemy airfields in southeast England, instead of ranging over the whole southern coastal area. In one of the greatest errors of the campaign, Goering also insisted that no more effort was to be expended on radar stations, since they were proving too difficult to destroy. Fighter tactics were also to change. Responding to bitter criticism of the fighter arm from his bomber pilots, Goering ordered the 109s to stick close to the bombers. The fighter leaders were horrified. They would be throwing away the advantage of height and the priceless ability to attack out of the sun. To make matters worse, because they would have to zigzag to keep station with the slower bombers, they would waste already precious fuel. Goering also ordered that the ratio of fighters to bombers be increased. For every bomber, there would be 3 fighters. As a result, the number of missions would have to be curtailed. There simply weren't enough 109s to escort all the available bombers. From the 19th to the 23rd of August, cloudy weather restricted daytime operations by the Luftwaffe to small-scale hit-and-run attacks. Meantime, night raids were intensified with the bombing of Liverpool, Sheffield, Derby, Coventry, and Hull. The aim was to cripple the industries on which Britain's fighter strength depended, but although there were many civilian casualties, aircraft production was hardly affected. It was on the 24th that major daylight operations began once more. With them commenced a period of crisis for RAF Fighter Command. The main targets of the new Luftwaffe tactics were the airfields of 11 Group, particularly the 7 sector stations. The first to be hit in this new phase of the battle was North Weald, which was badly damaged on the 24th. Hornchurch was hit the same day. On the 26th, Debden was bombed. On the 30th, Biggin Hill was struck twice, and the next day, Debden and Hornchurch were hit and Biggin Hill bombed once again. When the main targets were defended by British fighters, lesser airfields were hit instead, including Manston, Eastchurch, Lymm and Rochford. On the 31st, Detling, Croydon, Biggin Hill, Debden and Eastchurch were attacked. Hornchurch was hit twice. The first week of September saw no let-up in the fury of the German assault. Day after day, the same airfields were bombed and strafed until many, including several key sector stations, were barely able to function. In believing that the RAF could be forced to defend its inner airfields, Hermann Göring was being proved correct. The massive German fighter escorts were making it extremely difficult for the defenders to penetrate to the bomber formations, and often single squadrons would face 30 enemy bombers and an escort 100 strong. As British casualties grew, many squadrons had been reduced to a handful of experienced men, while the training of new flyers had been cut until many had only 9 hours in modern fighters. While many British fighter pilots were privately losing the belief that the RAF would survive the onslaught, ironically, amongst their German enemies, confidence was also steadily draining away. The last month had seen losses of aircraft running at 18%, and many bombers had returned badly shot up and with wounded crewmen. In August alone, Luftwaffe aircrew losses were 229 killed or captured, 80 wounded, and 264 missing. While RAF Fighter Command struggled for its existence in the face of relentless German pressure, a bitter dispute broke out between senior officers about Dowding's handling of the battle. The commander of 12 Group, Trafford Leigh-Mallory, supported by one of the RAF's most celebrated squadron commanders, Douglas Bader, insisted that tactics must be changed. Huge formations, called big wings, made up of 3 or even more squadrons, should be assembled to meet the Germans in force. In the opposing camp, 11 Group's commander, Keith Park, firmly supported Dowding and insisted that his policy was the right one. The RAF would survive only by committing its forces with the greatest caution. The arguments grew so fierce that cooperation between 12 and 11 Groups was seriously disrupted, and Leigh-Mallory took his campaign to have Dowding replaced all the way to Winston Churchill. The feuding within Fighter Command was taking place at the period of greatest strain for 11 Group and for Dowding himself. After a fortnight of concerted attacks on 11 Group's airfields, as landlines were severed and operations rooms destroyed, fighter control was becoming ragged and uncoordinated. Aircraft losses were now overtaking production, and the toll of pilots killed was so great that the system of rotating squadrons from hard-pressed to quiet sectors was breaking down. Fresh frontline squadrons were taking casualties so quickly that no rested units were available to take their place. RAF Fighter Command was on the brink of total collapse. While Fighter Command was struggling to survive the Luftwaffe's onslaught, Bomber Command had been restricted to raids on Germany's industries. However, on August the 24th, German bombs had been accidentally dropped on a London suburb, and the RAF was ordered to retaliate by attacking Berlin. British bombers made 5 minor raids on the German capital in 11 days. They did little real damage, but Adolf Hitler was incensed. On September the 4th, he made a furious speech calling the RAF night gangsters and vowing revenge.
Wir werden ihre Städte ausradieren. Wir werden diesen nachgeratenen Panzerkriegen vom Arsch verhelfen.
Hitler insisted that the Luftwaffe reply at once to the British raids on his capital by bombing London. On Saturday, September the 7th, Hermann Goering and Albert Kesselring stood together on the cliffs at Cap Gris-Nez in Normandy to watch a massive formation assemble for the Luftwaffe's first great daylight attack on London. The first wave of German aircraft was detected by British radar at 1600 hours. In all, there were more than 300 bombers and 600 fighters. In the belief that the target was again the sector stations, 21 British squadrons were scrambled. It soon became apparent that the target was London, and too late, the fighters were redirected to intercept. The main targets of the massed bombers were the London docks and the city's East End. Warehouses crammed with rubber, rum, sugar, and other highly inflammable materials were quickly a blazing inferno. As night fell, the flames guided 300 more bombers to the scene. Civilian casualties were unprecedented in an air raid on Britain. 448 people were killed. Over the following 4 days, bad weather gave the British capital some respite. But continued night attacks, and on the 11th, another heavy daylight raid, confirmed to RAF commanders that Luftwaffe strategy had indeed changed radically. With the German bombers concentrating on London, the pressure on Fighter Command's airfields had suddenly eased. RAF station commanders took immediate advantage of the lull. Damaged communications were quickly repaired, and cratered runways were reopened. Ground crew could once more maintain their aircraft in peace, and pilots could catch up with desperately needed rest. There was a new confidence. No matter what damage was done to London, and however regrettable, the direct threat to the survival of Fighter Command was over. It was the turning point of the battle. The next full-scale assault on London was on September the 15th. It began with a massive build-up of German aircraft that could be seen by British radar long before they headed for the Channel. With the near certainty that the target was the capital, 11 Group had plenty of time to form pairs of squadrons for the interception. 12 Group, also benefiting from the lengthy warning, could assemble even larger formations. To the Luftwaffe airmen, who had been told that the RAF was down to its last 150 fighters, the scale of the opposition would come as a brutal shock. The The first wave of German bombers was made up of 100 Dornier 17s of the 3rd and 76th Bomber Wings, with a powerful escort of 109s. The formation crossed the British coast at 11:30 hours. First to intercept were the Spitfires of 72 and 92 squadrons from Biggin Hill. As the raiders approached London, elements of another 19 squadrons joined the fray, including a big wing of 5 squadrons from 12 Group. As the German formations were met by one attack after another, the 109 escorts were gradually peeled away, either embroiled in combat or short of fuel. By the time the first wave of bombers reached London, they had lost almost all their fighter escort. Faced with the frenzied attacks of an enemy far more numerous than they had ever imagined possible, many bombers jettisoned their loads at random and ran for the Channel. Two hours later, the Luftwaffe launched a second massive raid, preceded by a powerful sweep of 109s. It fared no better than the first. British fighters, refueled and rearmed, once again met the raiders in numbers that staggered the German airmen. Altogether, in the two major raids of the day, the Luftwaffe lost 56 aircraft destroyed, 12 crash-landed, and many more severely damaged and with dead or wounded aircrew. The RAF had lost 20 Hurricanes and 7 Spitfires, with 7 more fighters crash-landed. While the confidence of the Luftwaffe had been all but shattered, for the British, the events of September the 15th marked the turning point. There was plainly no possibility that the German Air Force could decisively defeat the RAF before autumn weather made an invasion impossible. On September the 17th, Adolf Hitler ordered that Operation Sea Lion be postponed indefinitely. During the next 6 weeks, there were several more daylight raids on London. There were fighter clashes with heavy losses on both sides, but by the end of October, the air war had shifted to the hours of darkness. The Battle of Britain was over, and the RAF had won a victory simply by continuing to exist. During the Battle of Britain, 746 British fighters were lost, and 520 pilots were killed. On the German side, 1,733 aircraft of all types were destroyed, and of combat aircraft, losses ran at over 40% of the air fleet's initial strength. More than 2,600 German airmen were killed. In spite of the Luftwaffe's staggering losses, its failure to subdue Britain was of little concern to Adolf Hitler. He was already preoccupied with his long-cherished plan to invade the Soviet Union, and sooner or later he believed night bombing and blockade by U-boat would force the British to concede defeat. What Hitler would fail to anticipate was that after the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe would embark on its Russian campaign with far fewer aircraft than expected, and seriously weakened by the loss of so many experienced aircrew. the Battle of Britain would have one more far-reaching effect. Britain's struggle for survival had captured the imagination of millions of Americans, and with the United States entry into the war in December 1941, a potent alliance was created. Within 2 years, the island that the Luftwaffe had failed to subdue in the Battle of Britain would be transformed into a springboard for the liberation of Europe.